Snow White by Eric Blair. Once upon a time, there was a princess. She had snow white skin, blood red lips, rosy cheeks, and a shiny black hair. Her name was Snow White. On the day Snow White was born, her mother died. A few years later, Snow White's father took a new wife. This new queen became Snow White's stepmother. The queen was very proud of her own beauty. The wicked queen had a magic mirror. She would look into the mirror and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of us all?" The talking mirror would answer, "My lady queen is fairest of all." This made the evil queen happy. Snow White grew more beautiful. One day, the mirror told the queen that Snow White was the most beautiful person in the kingdom. This made the queen very jealous. The queen told a hunter to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. Snow White begged for mercy, and the hunter felt sorry for her, and he let her go. Snow White was alone and afraid. She wandered in the forest. At last, Snow White found a cottage. She didn't know it, but it was the home of the 7 dwarfs. Inside, Snow White found a tiny table set for dinner. She was very hungry, and she took a little food from each plate. Then Snow White lay down to sleep in one of the 7 tiny beds. When the dwarfs came home from work, they found the sleeping girl. The next morning, Snow White woke up and saw the dwarfs. She was afraid, but the dwarfs were friendly. Snow White told the dwarfs her story. The dwarfs decided she could stay with them, and she kept the cottage clean. Snow White gladly agreed. Each morning, the dwarfs went to work. They told Snow White to keep safe. "Don't let anyone in the cottage," one dwarf warned. The queen thought Snow White was dead. And one day, the queen asked her magic mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of us all?" The mirror said, "Snow White is fairest of all. With the 7 dwarfs she dwells." The queen dressed up like an old woman. She went to the dwarf's cottage. She pretended to have things to sell. "Good morning," Snow White said. "What do you have to sell?" The woman showed Snow White a fancy comb. The comb was pretty, but it was poisoned. The old woman put the comb in Snow White's hair, and Snow White fell to the floor. The dwarfs came home and found Snow White on the floor. When they took the comb out of her hair, she woke up. Snow White told the dwarfs about the old woman. "That old woman was really the wicked queen," one dwarf said. "Don't open the door to anyone." At the castle, the magic mirror told the queen Snow White was still alive. This time the queen poisoned an apple to kill Snow White. The queen dressed as an old woman and went back to the cottage. She offered the apple to Snow White. Snow White wanted the apple, but she didn't trust the old woman. But the queen was clever. She had put poison in only half of the apple. She took a bite from the half that wasn't poisoned to show Snow White that the apple was safe. Snow White took a bite of the other part of the apple and fell lifeless to the floor. When the dwarfs came home, they couldn't help Snow White. The dwarfs did not have the heart to bury Snow White. Instead, they built a coffin of clear glass for her. They placed the coffin on a hill in the forest. But Snow White was not really dead. For many years she lay asleep in that glass coffin. Her cheeks stayed rosy, her lips stayed red, her skin stayed white, and her hair black. A dwarf always stood guard. One day, a prince came into the forest. He saw the beautiful girl in the glass coffin. "I can't live without her," he said. The dwarfs let the prince have Snow White because he loved her. The prince's servants started carrying the coffin away. They stumbled, and the coffin was bumped. The piece of poisoned apple that had been stuck in Snow White's throat popped out. She opened her eyes and asked, "Where am I?" "You are with me," said the prince. "You are my true love. Please be my wife." Snow White said she would marry the prince, and the prince and the dwarfs were very happy. There was a fancy wedding, and the wicked queen came. She recognized Snow White right away. The queen ran away and was never seen again. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after. This is Snow White.